Before online gaming, before realistic graphics, before giant open worlds, there was a time when video games were simple, colorful, and fast, and fought through one of the most legendary rivalries in entertainment history, Nintendo versus Sega. And right at the center of that war was the Sega Genesis, a console that didn't just challenge Nintendo, but changed gaming culture forever. The Sega Genesis arrived during a very different era of gaming, the late 1980s, when arcades were still alive. Kids crowded around glowing cabinets filled with racing games, fighting games, and side-scrolling adventures. And at home, Nintendo dominated almost everything. The Nintendo Entertainment System had rebuilt the gaming industry after the crash of the early 1980s. For many players, Nintendo simply was gaming, which meant Sega faced an almost impossible challenge. How do you compete with a company everyone already trusts? Sega's answer was simple: don't copy Nintendo, be the opposite of Nintendo. When the Genesis launched in North America in 1989, it felt different, immediately darker, more aggressive, more futuristic. And unlike Nintendo's family-friendly image, Sega wanted attitude, speed, edge. The Genesis wasn't marketed as a toy, it was marketed as cool. Now pause here, because this next decision changed gaming history. Sega realized they couldn't beat Nintendo by playing safe, so they built an entire identity around rebellion. Their advertising became louder, faster, more aggressive, and eventually they created one of the most iconic slogans in gaming history. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. At the time, that line felt revolutionary. Console companies had never attacked each other so directly before, and suddenly gaming wasn't just about games anymore, it was about sides, teams, identity. And this strategy worked especially with teenagers. While Nintendo appealed heavily to younger audiences, Sega targeted players who wanted something that felt faster and cooler. Sports games, arcade experiences, action-heavy titles, everything about the Genesis screamed energy. But Sega still needed something critical: a mascot, a face for the brand. And eventually they found him, Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic wasn't just another character. He was designed specifically to compete with Mario: fast, confident, edgy, everything Mario wasn't. And when Sonic the Hedgehog launched in 1991, the Genesis suddenly became impossible to ignore. The speed felt unbelievable at the time. Bright colors rushed across the screen, levels moved quickly, music blasted through television speakers, and players loved the adrenaline. Sega didn't just sell games, they sold attitude. But the Genesis succeeded for another reason too: its hardware. At the time, the Genesis had a major technical advantage in one important area: speed. Many games simply felt faster and smoother than what players were used to on rival systems. Arcade-style experiences translated especially well. Sports games felt exciting, action games felt intense, and this gave Sega a clear identity. Now let's quickly look at 3 of the most played and defining Genesis games and why players loved them so much. First, Sonic the Hedgehog. Players loved the speed, colorful worlds, and energetic music. It felt fresh and exciting compared to slower platformers. Second, Mortal Kombat, legendary for its violence, digitized characters, brutal finishing moves, and the controversy that made kids want to play it even more. Third, Streets of Rage 2, a beat-em-up classic with incredible music and satisfying cooperative gameplay. Players loved teaming up with friends and fighting through waves of enemies together. And honestly, that's what made the Genesis era special: local multiplayer, friends sitting together on the floor, passing controllers, arguing over who won. Gaming felt social in a completely different way. But perhaps the biggest reason the Genesis became legendary was the console war itself. The Sega versus Nintendo rivalry became cultural. Schoolyard debates, magazine comparisons, commercial battles. Players defended their favorite console like sports teams, and for the first time, gaming felt competitive beyond the screen itself. Sega also pushed boundaries. Nintendo avoided the company, embraced edgier content, more mature themes, and sports partnerships that appealed to older audiences. This helped Sega grow rapidly in North America. For a brief moment, it genuinely looked like Sega might overtake Nintendo completely, and then the industry started changing fast. Technology evolved quickly during the 1990s. CD-based gaming emerged, 3D graphics became the future, and Sega faced increasing pressure to keep up. Genesis remained popular for years, but cracks began to show. Because despite all its success, the Sega Genesis had flaws, and some of them became more obvious over time. First, limited color palette and audio quality compared to later competitors. While the Genesis excelled in speed, some games lacked the richer visual detail and sound quality found on rival systems like the Super Nintendo, sparking endless debates among fans. Second, too many hardware add-ons. Sega released accessories like the Sega CD and 32X to extend the Genesis lifespan, but this confused consumers. Players didn't always know which version or add-on they needed, and developers struggled to support everything consistently. Third, a rushed transition into the future. As gaming moved toward 3D and CD technology, Sega's strategy became fragmented, too many overlapping products, weakening consumer trust over time. And yet, none of these flaws erase what the Genesis accomplished, because historically the Sega Genesis did something incredibly important. It forced competition. Before Sega, Nintendo dominated almost uncontested, but the Genesis pushed the industry forward: better marketing, faster innovation, more daring ideas, and more player choice. Without the Genesis, gaming history would look very different. Looking back now, the Sega Genesis era feels deeply nostalgic: the chunky cartridges, the click of the power switch, the colorful box art, the unforgettable startup sounds, and the excitement of renting games for the weekend from local stores. For many players, this was the era where gaming became personality, where players chose sides, where mascots mattered, and where the industry started becoming larger than life. The Sega Genesis wasn't the most powerful console ever made, and eventually it lost momentum, but its influence remains enormous. It proved that gaming could be bold, aggressive, stylish, and culturally competitive. More importantly, it gave millions of players memories they still talk about decades later: late-night multiplayer sessions, Sonic speedruns, Mortal Kombat arguments, and the feeling that gaming was evolving right in front of them. The Sega Genesis wasn't just a console, it was an attitude, a challenge to the biggest company in gaming, and one of the most important systems ever created. Because for a brief moment in the 1990s, Sega truly made the world believe that Genesis did what Nintendo won't. And right at the center of that war was the Sega Genesis. Genesis does what Nintendo won't. Sega's answer was simple: don't copy Nintendo, be the opposite of Nintendo. When the Genesis launched in North America in 1989, it felt different immediately. Sega wanted attitude, speed, edge. The Genesis wasn't marketed as a toy, it was marketed as cool.